Mr. Scott.
Good morning, my lady. May we call Christopher Stewart?
Thank you. Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Good morning, Mr. Stewart.
Good morning, Mr. Scott. Good morning, my lady.
Thank you for your assistance in the inquiry. When you're giving evidence today, can I ask you to please keep your voice up so that the stenographers can hear you clearly? And if there's anything unclear or if you're talking too quickly, then we may ask you to either slow down or repeat yourself. If you need a break at any point, please do just say. You have provided the inquiry with a witness statement dated the 4th of February 2024, and that's up on the screen. I take it you're familiar with that witness statement? And at page 38, you have your signature and the statement of truth. And please, can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes, I can.
If I can just start with your background. So you served in the office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, which was the predecessor to the Executive Office, or TEO as I'll refer to it throughout, from 2000 to 2006. And during the final year of your service in the Office of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, your responsibilities included civil contingencies matters.
That's correct.
You joined TEO on transfer in October 2018, and on taking up that appointment, you had overall policy and operational responsibility for all civil contingencies matters.
That's correct.
And in early 2020, prior to the pandemic, as part of that role, you would have been what's known as Chief of Staff for the Hub as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that was part of the role that I held.
Thank you. You plainly cover in your statement quite a similar area that Sir David Stirling did in his evidence yesterday. Did you hear the evidence of Sir David yesterday?
Yes, I was able to follow it in its entirety.
And as far as it relates to civil contingencies, was there anything in particular that you disagreed with in his evidence?
There was nothing that I fundamentally disagreed with. There are one or two areas where perhaps I could add a little bit of light and shade. And in particular, I would welcome the opportunity to cover ground, which I'm sure you'll wish to cover anyway, in terms of the timing of the stand-up and activation of the civil contingencies arrangements, and in particular how that might have impacted on the ministerial desire for greater grip or control over matters, particularly in the early part of the pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I will be coming to those. Just want to start with some kind of slightly more fundamental principles, because there's a lot of talk about civil contingencies and there'll be a lot of acronyms coming up. So the Civil Contingencies Policy Branch, that's known as CCPB, and that's part of TEO, and its responsibility is for civil contingencies, correct?
Yes.
And effectively, it's, as you describe it in your statement, its default state is business as usual. And if we could just have up on the screen INQ 30468-508, that's at page 17, thank you. So this is the statement of Miss Bernie Rooney, who was brought in August 2019. She sets out at paragraphs 78 through to 80 kind of the broad areas of work of CCPB. And so you can see there that there's liaising with Cabinet Office, developing, sharing guidance with Northern Ireland departments, liaising with other administrations. So there's a broad range of work that's done that relates to preparation and responding to potential civil contingency matters, correct? And I'm going to come back to the concept of sectoral resilience. But is it right that sectoral resilience is part and parcel of the business as usual role of CCPB?
Yes, it is. In addition to its overall policy role and its overall coordination role during times when it's in its operational role, it has a specific interest both during business as usual and during actual civil contingencies, specifically for sectoral resilience.
again, I'm going to return to that. I'm just trying to get some building blocks in place at the moment. So alongside the business as usual, you can have some, what I'm calling bolt-on requirements. And part of that can be activating the hub. And, I mean, activating the hub can happen at any point, realistically, can't it? We've heard Sir David talking about weather events and all the way up to pandemics, for example. So it can cover a wide range of issues.
Yes.
And CCPB always has to be ready to activate the hub. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in terms of when the hub's activated, then it has to be staffed.
Yes.
Is that right? And it's right that, as you describe it, it's not staffed by a standing army, but effectively you have the CCPB staff and then the volunteers from the wider Northern Ireland Civil Service are brought in to assist.
That's correct.
And is it also important that we don't mix up the idea of sector resilience on one hand and then the hub stand-up or NICMA activation on the other, because they do different things? Would you just be able to describe kind of the times when you would be doing sector resilience compared to standing up the hub and when they might intersect?
Certainly. It might be helpful just to set that in context of how the CCB role changes at the watershed point of stand-up and of a contingency being declared. As you rightly say, in business as usual mode, as its name implies, it's a policy branch. So the sorts of activities that it would be engaged in are very typical of other policy branches: policy, legislation, advice to ministers, strategies, reviews of plans and priorities, exercising, testing. When it flips into its operational mode, then its role changes quite significantly, and its core role is twofold. It's one, to provide the secretariat to the Civil Contingencies Group, the key decision-making body, and also to be the core of the staff of the hub. In terms of sectoral resilience, then, there's a similar change in its role between business as usual and an operational role. In business as usual mode, it would be responsible for coordinating and pulling together the sectoral resilience plans of individual departments and other public authorities. Whereas once a contingency is declared and the hub is in active mode, it would be coordinating the response to sectoral resilience issues as they arose. For example, if there was a particular challenge or problem or difficulty within a particular sector, to take an example, education, and that manifested itself in a problem that couldn't be solved within the education sector alone or by that department, then it's likely that that would be referred to the hub for assistance. And the hub might at that stage be involved in some work to try and identify a solution, or it may refer the matter to the Civil Contingencies Group for a decision, perhaps on to the executive, or even for very serious and extremely difficult matters, it might be necessary to liaise and refer the matter to the UK government.
So in terms of your kind of sector resilience, that will be happening effectively prior to or when there's no activation of the hub. Is that a fair summary of the situation?
That's correct, although I think as has already been made clear in evidence, that's one of the areas of work that was delayed or postponed because of the need to give priority to Brexit.
Yes. Just want to stay focusing with the hub at the moment. So the hub was a creation, effectively, of the response to EU exit.
Yes,
right?
it was.
And it was developed specifically for EU exit. It wasn't actually designed with a pandemic in mind, is that right?
It wasn't designed with a pandemic in mind. It was indeed, you rightly say, developed on the back of Brexit, but it was designed to be, if you like, contingency blind, to be sufficiently flexible to be deployed for any type of contingency that might subsequently arise. So it was designed and put in place initially for a specific purpose, but I think from the outset we envisaged it continuing as a mechanism that could be deployed as and when needed.
And wasn't it a slight quirk of the hub, I think as Mr. Harbison describes it, that actually it wasn't realistically possible to socially distance in the hub? And is that reflective of the fact that it was designed more with EU exit in mind, so rather than in a pandemic or a disease-based situation? but
I think
more...
that's entirely correct. I don't think that sort of consideration was ever part of the design process.
And in terms of staffing, you mentioned earlier on that the staffing of CCB form the core of the hub. Is it right that in February 2020, there were meant to be, there were about 5 members of staff in CCPB?
Yes, that's correct.
And that the intention would be that there would be 12 full-time equivalents, is that right?
I think the recognised complement would be around about 12, but it had been quite a few years since the staffing levels had been anywhere near that level.
But that wasn't through a reduction in the need for other staff. That was just a fact that you were finding it difficult to staff the hub over those years. Is that right?
There were a number of reasons for that. I think the main one was simply budget constraints through the years of austerity. I don't think it was a case of actually deciding to downsize the team at any stage, but as posts fell vacant, they tended not to be filled if the budget wasn't there to do so. Another difficulty that the team encountered was the difficulty in filling posts even when the budget is available, because there was a very restricted supply of staff at the key grades that endures indeed to this day. A third and perhaps unique difficulty that the team faced is that because of the nature of the posts and their sensitivity, many of them, in fact I think all of them, are subject to the second level of vetting known as security clearance. That's quite an intrusive process, and on more than one occasion we've been in a position where a job has been offered to a member of staff. It's been explained to them that it would be subject to security clearance, and they've declined on the basis that they would prefer not to have that level of intrusion in their private lives.
You also mentioned in your statement about the fact that civil contingencies work is quite specialist work.
Yes.
Did that play any part in the ability to staff up to the full complement?
I'm not sure whether it played a particular part in that particular difficulty, but what I did observe was, whilst the branch had become smaller over the years, there was, other than that, a very low turnover of staff, much lower than I would have expected in a comparable policy branch. So those who went there tended to stay there for long periods of time.
And in February 2020, is it right that around about the 6th of February that there was, effectively it had gone down to 2 members of staff?
Yes.
And then we can see in an email that was sent by Miss Bernie Rooney on the 21st of March 2020 that there's a line where she says, "At the minute, I'm a one-person hub and all of the issues related to COVID-19 are moving at pace." In your statement, you say that that shouldn't be taken literally because she's indicating the numbers of available volunteers beyond her own team. I think it's fair to say that in her statement, she says, from September 2019 to March 2020, I was the only TEO senior civil servant working on civil contingency matters located in Castle Buildings, which was where the on-site development of the NI Hub project was taking place.
That's correct.
So effectively, you had that one person on site from January through to 2020 working within CCPB?
At senior level, yes.
At senior level, yes. How does that compare with the intended staffing levels in senior level within CCPB? Was that intentional or is that significantly lower than it desired?
It might sound counterintuitive, but it's actually a slight increase. In normal times, that area of work would have been part of the responsibility of another grade 5, who's also responsible for the executive secretariat. Mrs. Rooney wasn't brought in specifically to take on an operational leadership role of civil contingencies, but she very kindly did take up that role when I asked her to do so. She was brought in, as you said, specifically to carry out a review of civil contingencies. But when the pressure began to ramp up, actually towards the end of the Brexit period and then into the period of the pandemic and preparation for it, Mrs. Rooney stepped up to the plate and became the de facto grade 5 responsible for civil contingencies and took on that role. So it was actually a slight increase in the staffing complement that we had.
Forgive my being slow, Mr. Stewart, but Mr. Scott's question was really described it as a one-person hub. How many people were working in the hub at whatever level?
It would depend, my lady, on the extent to which it was needed to be stood up. At its full complement, somewhere between 40 and 50 people would need to be there.
How many, when Ms. Rooney described herself as a one-person hub? You said, yes, I agree, at senior level. So you're saying there was one senior person there. How many other people were there working full-time?
I suspect on the day she wrote that, it was probably herself, Anthony Harbinson, who had, for reasons we might come on to, succeeded me in the Chief of Staff role, and those members of the core CCB team who were there, which may well have been as few as 2.
So, yes, it may have been a few. So the intention would be, when I say the intention, the historic intention would be 12. Realistically, it was 5.
Yes.
But then, as you said, in February, there was 2. And then you have Miss Rooney saying that she's the only senior member. So realistically, it can't be more than 2 that were in the hub in March, or apart from the fact that Mr. Harbinson had been added. Is that right?
On that particular day, I think in that particular week, I think the situation did improve in the week, or at least the fortnight after that, thanks to the sterling efforts of Mr. Harbinson.
Yes. And again, you were saying earlier on that there's a distinction between the CCPB, who form the core element of the staffing of the hub, and the fact that volunteers are added.
Yes.
So it's not simply that there was one CCPB person, there was nobody else. There might be other volunteers at the time. That's right?
Yes. Although I think, as Mr. Harbinson has said in his evidence, volunteers were difficult to obtain, much more difficult than we thought would be the case, and he had to work extremely hard to get sufficient numbers in place.
Well, yes. So on the 17th of March 2020, so that was the day after the executive had approved the activation of NICMA. That's correct?
That's correct.
So on the 17th of March, you sent a message to Sir David Stirling saying, the team is on its knees, Bernie and then another are both very tired. Only one volunteer so far. Is that a reference to the fact that by the 17th of March there'd only been one volunteer for the hub?
I think that's correct, yes.
If I can show, please, INQ 40911309. And this is an email sent by an individual within the Northern Ireland office. So this is not, the NIO had no specific role within the hub or creating the hub as of 12th of March 2020. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So if we can just see the second paragraph underneath where it says overview. Thank you. It says, in the proposal, and this is the proposal brought in advance of the 16th of March, the hub will have 28 roles. And just the line below it, for context, this is about 50% of what TEO ran in the full C3 Brexit structure, 55 roles. So when we're talking about the hub having been created for the purposes of EU exit, was effectively a full complement of hub staff then, 55 roles?
For it to run at its maximum intensity over a shift pattern, yes.
And so the intention around the 12th of March, as the NIO understood it, was that the hub would have 28 roles.
Yes.
And so is it not right that by the 17th of March, if you have Miss Rooney, you didn't have Mr. Harbinson by the 17th of March, is that correct? He came in a day or two later?
I believe he may have already been there on the 17th of March.
Okay, well, so we have Miss Rooney, potentially Mr. Harbinson as well, and at most 3, probably only one other staff member, and then one volunteer. So is that about 4 out of the 28 roles were filled at that point?
At most, yes.
What was your view on the capability of the hub to respond, given that you had 4 out of 28 roles filled on the 17th of March?
With only 4 out of 28, then the hub could only hope to discharge a very small proportion of its intended role. That doesn't give you anything like full operating capability. And had it remained at that level, that would have been a very serious matter. The hub simply couldn't have operated as intended.
You say in your statement, this is paragraph 105, that there was activation of the hub on the 26th of March. Just want to check, by that, do you mean that that's when it was effectively fully staffed with volunteers and it was fully up to speed?
I think that's my recollection, yes.
Okay. So, are you able to remember what its staffing was like on the 23rd of March when Northern Ireland went into lockdown?
I can't, unfortunately. By that stage, I had withdrawn from the role in the hub entirely for reasons that are set out in my statement. Around about the 12th of March, the medical and scientific advice was that anyone with an underlying health condition, such as asthma, which I have, needed to work from home. That came as a surprise and a bit of a shock. It presented a very significant difficulty for me in relation to the Chief of Staff role for which I was designated. That's a leadership role. It needs to be discharged by someone who is physically present in the hub, able to respond and provide leadership to the staff immediately. For a very short period, one or two days, Mr. Harbinson and I tried to discharge the role together, with him being physically present and me being remote, and that was in recognition that he had only just arrived and was getting up to speed with the role. That proved impractical for two reasons. One, as I said, I just don't think the role is something that can be discharged remotely. It needs someone to be on site. And two, as it very quickly became clear, you can't realistically have two chiefs of staff. There's a real risk of getting in each other's way or giving conflicting advice to staff. So very quickly, we both came to the pragmatic conclusion that one of us was going to have to do it, and it would have to be him.
Did Mr. Harmison have any background in civil contingencies?
He doesn't have any background in civil contingencies that I'm aware of, but it is a senior leadership role. It's not one that intrinsically calls for specific experience or qualifications in civil contingencies, but rather it calls for the generic competences of leadership, which Mr. Harbinson had in very great degrees, a very experienced colleague.
Yes, but if you're going to be running the NI Hub as its Chief of Staff, surely you would wish to have some kind of background in either the Hub or civil contingencies?
It certainly would have been preferable to have someone who was trained at least, and preferably with some experience in it, as I had been. So it was a very steep learning curve for him, and I think a significant challenge to be overcome. And again, as with Miss Rooney, I'm very grateful to him for having taken up the gauntlet at that point.
I mean, because, again, you say in your statement that there was no plan in place to deal with the contingency of the designated Chief of Staff being unable to take up the role. With hindsight, it is clear that there was enough. With hindsight, it is clear that there was enough to have been such a plan, and its omission was a regrettable oversight. Are you able to...
Sounds like a typing error. I think I meant ought to have been such a plan.
I may have misread it. It's probably my fault, not yours, Mr. Stewart. Is the fact that there was no plan to deal with the contingency of the Chief of Staff being absent, is that a reflection as well of the fact that it was created in the context of EU exit, where you're less likely to have senior members of staff be ill?
It is, and I would go slightly further than that, in that it's a model that would have had less risk associated with it for an influenza-type pandemic. Ironically, being in the high-risk group, I'm vaccinated every year for influenza, so if that had been the challenge, then there would have been no difficulty whatsoever in taking up the role. There were, within the structure of the hub, two designated Deputy Chief of Staff roles, but the planning assumptions for those were that they would step in from time to time if, for example, I needed to attend a meeting of CCG or even the executive, or even if the Chief of Staff had fallen ill for a short period and then needed to return. What we simply hadn't thought of at all was a situation where, because of medical advice, the Chief of Staff would be entirely unable to take up the role. As I've said candidly in my statement, that's an oversight. We ought to have thought of that and ought to have had a contingency in place.
And in terms of the Deputy Chief of Staff, were either the Deputy Chief of Staff in late March actually the two Deputy Chief of Staff who were intended when the hub was being planned, or were they completely different people?
One would have been Miss Rooney, the other would have been grade 7, who was very heavily involved in the Brexit work and very experienced.
Okay, so one of the Deputy Chief of Staff had experience at the hub, but Miss Rooney didn't have any experience at the hub.
She didn't have as much. She joined a month or two before the final completion of the Brexit work, so she would have had some familiarity with it, but certainly not as much as the other colleague.
Okay. And I just want to press you a little bit further, because one of the essential purposes of CCPB is planning for eventualities of civil contingencies, emergencies, situations like that. Part and parcel of that is about planning for resilience, correct?
Yes.
How is it that the resilience of the staff of the hub was not something that was thought about in advance?
It wasn't thought about enough at senior level. I would contend that it was very much part of the thinking on the overall complement of the hub. So we had in total, I think, a cadre of volunteers around 180 strong. And that was an expectation of us being able to man the hub to whatever degree was necessary over a prolonged period. Even that was suboptimal. In the design for the hub, the consultants who designed it recommended a particular ratio of staff to roles, and the ratio that they recommended was 8:1. Now, if you can achieve 8:1, that gives you a very considerable degree of resilience, even if you're running a shift pattern over a prolonged period. In actuality, we didn't manage to get a ratio of any more than 5:1 at any given time, which is enough to run a shift pattern with some resilience, but only, I think, for a limited time. But your observation is correct. We simply hadn't given enough thought to resilience at a senior level. There was a Chief of Staff role, 2 Deputy Chief of Staff roles. That would have seen us through for a period, but in the event of a need to maintain the hub in operation for anything more than, I think, a couple of months, that would have given us a very significant resilience challenge.
Was there any detrimental impact upon the response to the pandemic of those staffing arrangements?
Do you mean in particular Mr. Harbison substituting for me?
No, well, that, but also generally broader in terms of the lack of staffing numbers that you had within the hub.
I think specifically in Mr. Harbison's case, no. He's a very experienced and capable colleague. He had a very steep learning curve, which I think he successfully negotiated. And I'm extremely grateful to him for the leadership that he showed in taking up the role. In relation to the overall numbers of staff available for the hub, as I've said, our starting point was below the ideal ratio for numbers available. And Mr. Harbison encountered very significant difficulties in the first week in even getting those numbers to come forward. That presented, I think, very real challenges and very real difficulties for him, and I'm sure in his evidence he will have said more about this. It required him to bring forward innovative solutions, and you will have seen from his evidence he did directly approach the 4 largest consultancy firms in Northern Ireland with a plea for help, which was forthcoming. So there was a difficulty, there was an effect. It required Mr. Harbison to find innovative solutions, but I'm glad to say I think he was successful in doing so.
It's never the intention in the early stages of the activation of Nick Moore, the activation of the hub, that some of the focus of the hub will be taken up on trying to get in sufficient staff in order to run it. Is that right?
That's correct.
I also want to talk about your role specifically. So effectively, in late March 2020, your role that you'd had as Director of CCPB, Chief of Staff of the hub, and then responsibility for planning, that was effectively divided up into 3.
Yes.
Yourself, Mr. Harbison, and
Karen
Ms. Pearson.
Yes.
Does that show that it was never realistic that during a pandemic, the breadth of your role could have been performed by one person?
I think that's a fair conclusion to draw. I think, knowing what we know now, I don't think anyone would argue that the totality of the roles could be carried out by one person for any length of time. There were times when all three of us were very busy. My view on it now is that I think it calls for at least 2 roles and at times more than that. So I think I have to concede that that is a shortcoming in the design and one that should be rectified going forward. But I would say that the need that arose to apply additional leadership capacity to the work was not unique to us in Northern Ireland. If you look at the experience of the Cabinet Office around about that time, it seemed to us that there were new teams and new senior colleagues arriving there almost on a daily basis.
You said that it would be performed by at least 2 people in terms of the breadth of
That would be
role.
my view, yes.
Yes. To be fair to you, you do say in your statement, in the event of a future pandemic, a simpler management structure would apply, as Ms Pearson's role carries responsibility for all civil contingency matters, and then it's likely an approach for legislation. It's likely an approach similar to the Covid-19 task force would be adopted with the lead responsibility being taken by Ms Pearson's role. Doesn't that demonstrate that at the moment one person, so Ms Pearson, would be asked to perform 2 of the 3 roles that were undertaken during the pandemic by you, Ms Pearson, and Mr Harbinson? Again, is that too much for one person?
In my view, it would be. As things currently stand, and forgive me if I wasn't clear, that's what I meant by my statement. If the same situation arose today, then it would be under, at present, the single leadership of Ms Pearson. Her role in that regard didn't have the other elements of my role at that time. I was also responsible for Executive Information Service, the Executive Secretariat, and ministerial private offices. And those are not things that fall to her. So her current role would allow her to devote a greater proportion of her time to that, but it would remain my view that there would be more than enough work there for 2 people.
So actually, that current structure has come about following the Civil Contingencies Framework Review, which I think took place in late 2021.
Yes.
So that is even after there has been a review conducted following on from the pandemic.
Yes.
And is it right to say that you believe that that should probably be looked at again in terms of, is that too much for one person?
That's a personal view, but I think I would have to concede it's a personal view from distance. It's an area of work that I haven't been involved in since May of 2020. Colleagues who undertook the review, and indeed Ms Pearson now, I think would be much better informed than I am about what's actually required.
Yes. But that is based on your personal experience, having performed that role for a number of years?
For a period and for a contingency as challenging and as difficult as a COVID pandemic, yes.
If I can turn now to sectoral resilience. If we can show INQ 000 411 508. Thank you very much. It's a paragraph 52. And it's the end of the second line. Sectoral resilience, that is the coordination of action to support key public services, key economic sectors, and the functioning of society generally. You describe that as TEO's specific responsibility. In the context of civil contingencies, would that always be within TEO's responsibility?
Broadly, yes, although that paragraph, I think, is a very specific reference to planning and preparation for an influenza pandemic.
Well, you say planning for an influenza pandemic. Would it not also be planning for any pandemic?
Yes.
And you were talking earlier on about how sector resilience is about coordination.
Yes.
And you refer in your statement about coordination of action. Please, can you describe how TEO goes about coordinating that action?
Again, I would draw a distinction between the sort of planning role or the prepare phase of a contingency and the respond phase or the operational phase. So in prepare mode, if I may use that shorthand, TEO's role would be to regularly review plans prepared by individual departments and public authorities and to do the joining up of that. One of the key lessons that we learned from Brexit is that it's necessary but not sufficient for departments to plan individually, and there needs to be someone, in this case TEO, taking an overview and joining up the plans and drawing the lessons and the inferences for that. If I could give an example perhaps to illustrate that, and this was the case in preparation for Brexit, quite a number of departments and public authorities would have identified and planned for risks which might have included the risk of public disorder. Not unnaturally, in their plans, they would have looked to PSNI to respond to that and to deal with the necessary risk. But if a number of public authorities are planning on that basis individually, and if we don't draw that information together and present it to PSNI, then PSNI is not in a position to do its own planning and to ensure that it has the necessary resources in place or the ability to take the necessary prioritisation decisions. And that's where the joining up and coordination role comes into its own for TEO. It's not specifically an audit or quality assurance role, although if TEO was of the view that there were deficiencies or gaps in a plan, then we would point that out to the authority or department concerned. But TEO would not itself have the expertise, for example, to critique a plan from education or infrastructure, and certainly not from health. When we move into the operational phase, then TEO is part of the hub and is part of the civil contingencies arrangements. What it would be doing there is responding to sectoral resilience issues as and when they're raised by departments or public authorities. And as I said earlier, either being part of trying to coordinate or develop the solution, or escalating the issue still further to CCG or the executive or even beyond if that were necessary.
So in terms of in the prepare phase, you would effectively be looking to ensure that the issues that departments need to deal with are covered, as you say, doing the joining up aspect.
Yes.
And that when you're in an activated stage, so when the hub's up and running, when NICMA's been activated, then you're more likely to be responding to points that have been raised.
Yes.
Right. And it's not your role to identify, as we saw in your statement, for example, how public services should be supported or how society should function generally. That remains the responsibility of the individual departments who have the specialist knowledge. Is that right?
Yes. The hub is very much a coordination mechanism.
And I just want to give an example of how that played out actually in the pandemic. If we can see INQ 000309230, it's a document we actually saw yesterday. Now, this is an email that was circulated by the Civil Contingency Secretariat on the 6th of March 2020, just to orientate ourselves a little. Civil Contingency Secretariat is a body that falls within the Cabinet Office, and it's broadly equivalent to CCPB, is that right?
It is, although very much larger and more sophisticated in its capabilities.
What was the relationship like between CCS and CCPB prior to the pandemic?
Very positive.
Did you share expertise, best practice, anything along those lines?
Broadly, yes. I can't cite specific examples of that, but there would have been regular and ongoing liaison between Catherine Hammond's team and mine.
Just coming back to this document here, I'm not concerned about the specific time moving it or the precise details are in it. So what we see in this email is that CCS is asking departments, Whitehall departments, for information. It's talking about specific interventions and asking departments to identify what they consider to be impacts. Thank you. And then you can see specifically there, they're referencing specific groups such as vulnerable elderly person, and they've also asked to consider possible mitigations. Is that the type of activity that CCPB would have done in Northern Ireland when it comes to, in general, in principle, in relation to the Northern Ireland departments?
Yes, if a commission to do so were received from the Civil Contingencies Group or the Executive. I don't know the origins of that particular request from Cabinet Office, whether it came directly from the Secretariat there on their own initiative, or whether they were tasked with doing that by COBRA or by Cabinet. Within Northern Ireland, I think it's unlikely that CCPB would initiate an exercise like that on its own initiative, but might well be tasked with doing so by the Civil Contingencies Group or the Executive.
Why wouldn't it do that itself?
tends to operate under direction from the Civil Contingencies Group, perhaps with less autonomy than the Cabinet Office Civil Contingencies Secretariat would have. I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. I'm simply saying that in my experience, I think it's not at all unlikely that it would be engaged in that sort of activity, but I think it's more likely that that would have been directed by CCG rather than initiated by CCPB. Forgive me, I'm using a great many acronyms.
CCG in normal times meets 3 times a year, is that right?
Yes.
So in between those meetings, why wouldn't it be that CCPB, given its experience in civil contingencies, given its role for sectoral resilience, why wouldn't it be seeking to perform this equivalent task and instead of waiting to be commissioned by CCG or the executive?
Well, if I understand that particular task, and I do remember
Please don't worry about this specific task. I mean, this is an example of the task that might be performed.
Well, I think it is. I understand your point, but it's an example that arose in particular circumstances. I mean, this was in the early stages of preparation for the pandemic, so this was not business as usual by the Cabinet Office. This was a very specific exercise for a very specific reason. There is no reason why in a business as usual period CCPB wouldn't be gathering information, testing the state of preparedness of sectoral resilience. To the extent to which it didn't do so in the years preceding the COVID pandemic, I think that's a direct result of the resource constraints and the lack of staffing resource that was available in the team.
So let's say, for example, departmental contingency plan. Doesn't really matter which department. Would that have included specifically asking about impact upon groups such as disabled, children, or others who might be potentially particularly impacted by any given situation? Would that something that would be considered?
Possibly. It may not have been as sophisticated as a request as that. I say that simply because in the period where we were focused on this in February and through into early March, the question that we asked, but that might have been more a product simply of the urgency of that particular period, was to departments, let us have your plans, let us see them, what is your state of readiness? I don't think we went further than that in asking the more specific questions that are in that example.
And why was that the case? Was that because of a lack of staff availability, as you indicated earlier on, or was that for a different reason?
I think it was more a case of one step at a time, and the first step being, let's get the plans in, have a look at them, and see where the gaps are.
And is it not a gap if you start? Is it not a gap if you're considering that there's an absence of consideration of groups who might be particularly affected by a plan?
I would accept that, yes.
If I can move on now to the actual particular pandemic response. You say in your statement that it's actually the UK government who provided the official advice that preparation for the Covid-19 pandemic should be on the basis of the extant influenza plan, and that this remained the advice until sometime in March 2020.
Yes.
Whether or not the influenza plan should have been used in response to Covid-19 wasn't a matter for CCPB or TEO, is that right?
Yes.
Your role was effectively to implement the plan that was to be used in response to that pandemic, is that correct?
And specifically a particular strand of the plan that fell to TEO, which was sectoral resilience.
Okay. Again, just touching upon Miss Rooney. So Miss Rooney was brought in August 2019 in order to conduct a strategic review of civil contingencies within CCPB, that's right?
Yes.
I mean, Miss Rooney says in a statement, I'd been in post for 6 months at that time. I did not have an informed understanding of what was meant by sector resilience. It was the responsibility of the head of Civil Contingencies Policy Branch. Is it not a cause of concern that Miss Rooney could have been involved in CCPB for 6 months and still not have an informed understanding of what was meant by sector resilience?
I was surprised to see that statement. It's not for me to put a gloss or an interpretation on what she's said, but my assessment at the time was that she was a very high-performing individual who I thought in a comparatively short period of time had got to grips very effectively with what the role of CCPB was. But I absolutely understand and respect the concern I think that she's expressing there.
Again, coming back to staffing numbers, if you had 5 members of staff, again, I think that's where we've settled, and one was Miss Rooney, is the practical implication of Miss Rooney's statement that Northern Ireland had at best 4 people within CCPB involved in sector resilience prior to the pandemic? That's correct.
I wouldn't dispute in any way that CCPB was, even at its full complement, a small team. And as you've correctly set out, it was nowhere near its full complement. It was a very small team.
And again, Miss Rooney observes that her view was that staff within the existing CCPB lacked the expertise, skills to undertake a cumulative risk assessment of the emerging pandemic. Would you agree with that?
Not entirely. I respect her giving that view, but I wouldn't entirely agree with that. I think there was greater expertise in relation to that in Karen Pearson's team, which is why it was a very considerable benefit when they joined us. But I think there was expertise, sufficient expertise within CCPB, albeit concentrated in a small number of people, to do that assessment at the time when I asked them to do it.
In terms of the timeline, Ms Pearson's team arrived around the 14th of March.
Yes, that's correct.
So I think Ms Rooney's statement is that within the existing CCPB, again, you're saying that you thought that those 4 individuals did have sufficient expertise and skills to undertake a cumulative risk assessment prior to the 14th of March?
Yes. But I respect Ms Rooney's right to take a different view on that.
And Ms Rooney's view would be based on her role that you tasked her to do to effectively perform a review of those issues such as experience, skills, expertise within CCPB?
Yes, and I think particularly in feeding into that review, the recommendations in the lessons learned reports from PwC consultants following the design exercise for the hub.
Okay. Because you say that you reached the conclusion that there was a need for a greater focus on preparation, particularly in relation to cumulative planning and risk assessment. Is that right?
Yes.
And you'd actually reached that view prior to February 2020?
Yes. One
of the documents that we've had, which is referred to frequently, and I'd like you to be able to talk about it, is INQ 000 205 712. And this is a document that you prepared, as we can see from the top there.
Yes.
Strategic review of civil contingencies arrangements. So the question that I was just asking about, the focus on preparation, is this a document that arose from your view that you needed a greater focus on preparation?
It does. Perhaps before I turn to that, I may not have been sufficiently clear in my previous answer, or I may have been answering perhaps a little too literally. It was not my view that Civil Contingencies Policy Branch had all the capacity or capability that it needed to fully discharge the entirety of the role that I envisaged for it. But at that particular point in time, in February 2020, it was my view and remains my view that it had sufficient capacity to deal with the immediate challenge of gathering together the sectoral resilience plans in preparation for the coronavirus pandemic. As that paper sets out, and as I've just said, I think there's an important point perhaps which is worth bearing out here, because it touches on a concern I think raised by Ms Dobbin in her questioning of Sir David Stirling, and indeed in her opening remarks, where I think she understandably asked, why in the teeth of the pandemic were you talking about a review, and why in a document that describes a review were you talking about possible future emergencies, when it was well known at that point that we were about to enter into a pandemic. The explanation for that is that despite its timing, That exercise was not ever intended to be part of the response to COVID. It long predates that for the very reasons that you've given. It's long in gestation. Its origins go back to August 2019 when I asked Ms Rooney to join the department to carry out just that review. Folded into that were the lessons learned reports from PwC on the experience of standing up the hub, and Ms Rooney's own assessment of what capacity the situation was at that time. And its focus is very much future-looking. Its focus is very much on dealing with new types of contingencies where we hadn't even begun to plan. And perhaps the most obvious example there is cyber attacks, particularly where they would relate to critical national infrastructure, such as the power transmission and distribution network. That was an area of work that CCPB had simply never been able to get into, and it was my view that we needed additional capacity to do that going forward. And that was the provenance of the review. But it was not intended to be part of the response to COVID. That document is dated February. It wouldn't be remotely conceivable even to start a review, never mind finish one, in the period before the pandemic arrived. There was also a concern, I think, expressed that, were we resorting to a classic civil service tactic there in the face of a problem, let's call for a review and simply kick the can down the road. Again, I'd like to, if I can, reassure you that that was not the case. This review was an entirely different purpose. It wasn't part of the solution that I required in terms of our ability to respond to the pandemic. The solution to that, by that time, could only be found in transferring staff from other parts of the department to give us a short-term boost in our capacity.
In terms of the review, though, if you're going to carry out a review, somebody's got to carry it out.
Yes.
Who is going to carry that out?
It would have been led by Ms Rooney, but as is laid out in that paper, in her estimate, it wasn't something that one person could do. Even the review needed additional capacity, and our request was for approval to, in addition to our own team, to employ some consultancy resource to assist with that.
But you're taking resources away from CCPB in late February, just before the pandemic. You're taking resources away in late February. Surely at that point in time, you don't want to weaken the capacity of CCPB by asking them to do something else.
That's entirely correct, which is why the review did not commence at that time.
Yes, but you say, and we can see on the screen there, that the issue is civil contingent arrangements in Northern Ireland have not been reviewed for over 20 years. This paper seeks agreement to commission a strategic review. Is that not demonstrating that your intention was that the review would be carried out at that time?
No, that wasn't my intention.
Well, then why would you put a paper to the board asking for a review to be carried out if you didn't intend it to be carried out around that time?
Quite simply because even at that stage, and I appreciate that this may appear incongruous, there was some normal business as usual still being transacted within the department, and this was part of the normal business as usual. That paper, as I said, was long in gestation. It finally got to the point where it was ready to go to the departmental board in February, and the board's approval was secured. But at no stage, and I regarded that as approval to proceed at the right time, at no stage would I have considered taking resource away from Civil Contingencies Policy Branch in the teeth of a pandemic to carry out a review. That would have made no sense.
If we can go to page 9 of this document, please, paragraph 23. And again, it's worth remembering that this is a document that you'd authored. No actions taken to address the lessons learned and to implement recommendations. So that opening sentence is effectively, if the current position continues, is that right?
Yes.
It then goes on, the risk arises that civil contingency arrangements in Northern Ireland will fall even further behind the rest of the UK, and the executive and wider society may not be prepared for or have the capacity and capability to deal effectively with an emergency situation should a major contingency present. Given that's the 25th of February, do you not consider that there was a likelihood of a pandemic and that therefore a major contingency had presented itself by that point?
It was, and again, I was conscious in Ms Doblin's opening remarks that that might be interpreted as a belief on my part that a pandemic was not inevitable. That was not the case at that stage. There was also a concern raised, I think, on behalf of one of the core participants in the opening statements that how could I be asking the departmental board for a review and stating very robustly there, as I did, that it was necessary in February, but yet be assuring ministers in March that we had the capacity to mount the immediate response to the COVID pandemic. The explanation there is that the scope of that paper is a review to ensure that going forward we had the entirety, all of the capacity and capability that we needed to deal with all conceivable contingencies going forward. On the separate question of were we in March 2020 or even earlier able to take the immediate steps that were necessary to respond to the COVID pandemic, my view was yes, but only just. I said in my statement I thought we had adequate. What I meant by that was just enough and no more resource to mount that response. But I certainly didn't intend to imply by that statement that CCPB had all the resource that it could possibly need to do all the things that it could possibly be called on to do, hence the need for the review.
Yes, although is it not fair that the paragraph that you've authored there on the 25th of February 2020 is a little bleaker in tone about may not be prepared for or have the capacity and capability to deal effectively with? That's a bit bleaker than what you're currently saying now. Do you agree with that?
No, and if I've given you the impression this morning that it wasn't as bad as that, then let me take the opportunity to correct that. It was my view from quite early on in my tenure in TEO and remains my view today that at that point in time, Civil Contingencies Policy Branch was very considerably under-resourced for the task that it was tasked with doing.
Okay. What's unequivocal from that paragraph is that you were concerned that there was a deficit in the ability of CCPB to prepare for an emergency situation. Is that right?
Yes.
So if you had that view on the 25th of February 2020, had that led you to put extra emphasis on the need to prepare prior to February 2020 in the event of pandemic, when you were hearing whispers that COVID was potentially likely to be a major issue for Northern Ireland?
Yes, if I forgive me if I understand your question correctly. It was clear from an email that I received on the 22nd of January from the head of the branch that we were behind in our planning and preparation. She put it very succinctly in saying that we were 18 months behind where we ought to have been in terms of preparation for an influenza pandemic. So from that point on, I was encouraging and indeed directing the team, probably ad nauseum, to give priority to planning and preparation. Because one of the key lessons that we had learned from the work on Brexit was the importance of doing just that, and the importance of doing not only the risk assessment, but the cumulative risk assessment across departments and public authorities. That's what's behind my encouragement and constant expectation of the branch to prioritise that at that stage. And that is what is behind the advice that I was giving, which I'm sure we'll come on to, in terms of the appropriate point at which to activate the hub and to move into operational role. That is a matter of very fine judgment. Activate too late and you impede the response. Activate too early and you won't have made sufficient progress in the planning. And again, I think the importance of planning was emphasised in the opening remarks of a number of the core participants.
Yes, again, it's important to focus on the planning and the preparation stage. You're talking here about preparation. We're not actually at the point of activation yet, are we?
No.
This is about focusing in the planning stage.
Yes.
So what emphasis are you putting on the additional planning at this point in February 2020, given your view about the potential deficit and the ability to plan?
I'm directing the team to set it as their top priority, which indeed they did. They worked extremely hard on it. Got us to the point where by the 9th of March we were able to present to Sir David Stirling our initial overview, our initial coordination of sectoral resilience plans across all departments. And as I think you quoted from earlier, my signal to him that as a result of that extremely busy period that the branch had had, I think the phrase I used was that they were on their knees.
Because if we could go to INQ 000 309 214. And it's focusing at the top. We'll focus at the top and then we'll scroll down. So we can see that that's an email from you on the 6th of February 2020. And this is about sector resilience. You've got an indication here about the outbreak might not peak in China for another 5 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after that. And then this is where it's come from about CCPB down to 2 members of staff. I'll need to take some fairly drastic reprioritisation decisions. If we can just go down to the email that's below that, which is from, it says redacted there. Is that actually from Professor McBride? Is that likely that it's actually from the CMO?
Yes, I think so.
So you have an email there from the 6th of February from the CMO to you saying, I anticipate the cross-government coordination and wider sector resilience aspects will ramp up significantly. So on the 6th of February, by that point in time, you had your own concerns about the ability of CCPB to plan for an event such as a pandemic, is that right?
Yes.
And you had the CMO saying, I anticipate the wider sector resilience aspects will ramp up significantly. But that's a bit of a pinch point if, as your email above says, you have 2 members of staff, you have concerns about planning, and the CMO suggesting that wider resilience will need to ramp up. Were you satisfied that CCPB could give an adequate and an effective response in those circumstances?
My view was that it could give an inadequate initial response, but I had a very real concern about resilience or sustainability of that effort for anything other than a short period. And that's why there are the 2 references there, one to asking NIO colleagues for help, which in the end I didn't do, but also to the step which I did take on 19th of March, if I recall correctly, which was to, with ministerial agreement, suspend all work on the programme for government and reprioritise and redirect actually an entire division of staff from work on the programme for government onto COVID work.
Just want to dive a little deeper into that. If we can go to INQ 40/92712. And I think this is probably the document that you were referring to earlier on from the head of civil contingencies. But it's probably the document you were referring to earlier on. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we scroll down to paragraph 3, please. Thank you very much. And we can see there, it's under the heading of sector resilience. CCPB was allocated responsibility for taking forward the sector resilience element of pandemic flu preparations a few years ago, allocated to CCPB in the CCG-NI sector resilience programme. It's taken on as a non-health related issue, just pausing there, health related issues would be dealt with by the Department of Health.
Yes.
However, no work had commenced on it due to competing priorities, and then the impact on staff resources due to EU exit preparations. This has resulted in Northern Ireland being more than 18 months behind the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of ensuring sector resilience to any pandemic flu outbreak. It's clear that there's a pressing need to move forward. So is that what you're talking there, that in the 18 months, you're 18 months behind the rest of the United Kingdom? Plainly, any planning that happens in 18 months can have an impact upon how someone like a civil contingencies body would respond in the event of a pandemic.
Yes.
And also you're saying there that the reason why no work was done was other priorities and staffing resources.
Yes, that was the advice that I was given, and I have no reason to doubt that that was the reason.
The staffing resources situation wasn't actually any better by January 2020, is that right?
Correct.
If we can please have up, and this is your statement, it's INQ 000411508. Thank you, this is page 12. You deal with this at length in your statement. Fair to show this. If we can go to paragraph 51. You say you don't recollect that document. And then at paragraph 52. So I don't recall being made aware of such concerns prior to receipt of that document. So that's the 22nd of January. You don't remember being aware of what people within CCPB considered being 18 months behind England, behind the rest of the United Kingdom prior to the 22nd of January?
No, it hadn't been brought to my attention until that point.
And then this is the section where we were dealing earlier on with sectoral resilience. You then say at the bottom, and this is the rapid pace of, if we could just have the zooming section back in, please. So it's the last 3 lines. The rapid pace of developments around that time. What time do you mean by that?
From that point on, from late January through into February and March.
Okay. So it meant that the focus shifted rapidly thereafter from the development of a more general plan onto a small number of discrete tasks. And then if we can go over the page, please. And then those top 3 bullet points. So those are the 3 tasks. So it's input into the development of Coronavirus Act 2020, ensuring readiness to activate the NICRA protocol, and preparing for the activation of the hub.
Yes.
You don't actually include in there any of the sectoral resilience work in advance of a pandemic.
Those I would have seen as the 3 most pressing priorities, or if you like, the innermost concentric circle. The next priority after that is to do the work with departments and other public authorities in gathering in the plans. Probably worth saying as well that had we not been 18 months behind in our planning, those I would have seen as the top 3 priorities in a well-developed plan.
So, sectoral resilience from January through to March 2020, using the timeframe you used earlier on, wasn't one of the top priorities.
Sorry, I've given you the wrong impression there, and I think perhaps with hindsight my statement is less than clear on that point. In the situation that where we found ourselves in January, my judgment was that we needed to do 2 sets of things. The first was those 3 points that are on the highlighted document. The second was to get the sectoral resilience planning underway at great pace, and those things were done. I apologise if that's not reflected clearly in the statement.
Did CCPB have the capacity to do these aspects and sectoral resilience with the limited number of staff that it had between January 2020 and then when the hub was stood up in March?
With a very considerable volume of work on their part, yes, and not without very considerable pressure. And that is why at the end of that period, my advice was that the team was on their knees.
Again, I just want to focus on the planning, because again, prior to the 16th of March, you were still in the planning and preparation phase, is that right?
Yes.
So if we just go, again, same document, if we go down to paragraph 59, please. And if we can zoom in there. And this is discussing CCPB, form the view, the focus on preparation, which you've highlighted there, about the need for preparation. And it's that bottom line. Fortunately, it was possible to address this by involving the Brexit team, which was skilled and experienced in planning and risk assessment in the preparation for the pandemic. Are you saying there that planning really was advanced when the Brexit team joined?
It was advanced to a certain point. By 9th of March, I think it was, we had done the initial coordination exercise in gathering in the resilience plans from departments. The arrival of the Brexit team, I think, gave that work a considerable boost, significantly boosted our capacity, took some of the pressure off the CCBP team at that point. And I think if I may characterise it in this way, the CCPB approach had been very much bottom-up, gathering in the plans, assessing them, trying to spot the gaps and join the dots, as it were. That was complemented by the arrival of the Brexit team, which took more of a top-down approach, starting by identifying critical risks and then seeing how they were reflected in the sectoral resilience plans that were coming forward. The two approaches were complementary.
I'm going to look at the actual planning just after the break, Mr. Stewart, but let's get the timeline correct. So the Brexit team joined on the 14th of March?
Yes.
And the WHO had declared a global pandemic on the 11th of March?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Would you agree that's very late in the day for having the sufficient planning resources?
I would absolutely accept that point. I would absolutely accept the point that our planning overall was very late in the day. Sir David said yesterday, and I entirely agree with him, we were not as well prepared as we ought to have been. We ought not to have been 18 months behind in our planning for an influenza pandemic. We got to where we got by mid-March by dint of extremely hard work by a small and under-resourced team over a very short period. That is not a satisfactory position to be in, and it is not a position that I would seek to defend. We ought not to have been in that position. We ought to have been better prepared.
You do say, and thank you for that document can come down now, I believe. You do say in your statement that as it transpired, the influenza pandemic plan was of limited utility in relation to the Covid-19 pandemic, which presented a wholly different challenge in relation to sectoral resilience and required a substantially different response. Just want to clarify there, Mr. Stewart, are you saying that in the end, any lack of sector resilience didn't matter because, in effect, the wrong plan was being used?
No, absolutely not. And I want to ensure that I'm not giving you that impression. The fact that we were behind in planning for influenza is a serious matter. We ought not to have been in that position. Prior to Brexit and prior to COVID, an influenza pandemic was our number one risk. Being 18 months behind in the planning for your number one risk is not a satisfactory position and not one that I would attempt to defend. The point that I was trying to make is that notwithstanding the very hard work of the branch to get, if you like, influenza-based plans together in the period from the end of January to early March, quite simply the world turned upside down with the announcement of lockdown. And all of the planning that we had done to that point, late though it was, from that point forward, in my view, was of limited utility. And I might perhaps illustrate that with a couple of examples, if I may. A sectoral resilience plan for an influenza-type pandemic in education would essentially be looking at the task of how do you keep the schools system going with a 20% absence rate at any given time. A sectoral resilience plan for education in a coronavirus type pandemic presents a wholly different challenge because the school system is closed. The challenge there is how do you ensure sectoral resilience of the delivery of education to children when you no longer have a functioning schools system. Similarly in health, although it wasn't TEO's role to do the sectoral resilience planning in health, the sectoral resilience plan in health for an influenza type pandemic is quite simply how do you maintain services with a 20% absence rate? In a coronavirus pandemic, one of the challenges is how do you maintain health and social care when the schools are closed and when large numbers of parents perhaps are unable to come to work because they're having to make alternative childcare arrangements. That's what I meant when I said that an influenza plan was of limited use in the actual circumstances of a COVID pandemic. I was absolutely not trying to give the impression that the fact that we were late to the game on influenza planning didn't matter it did matter in and of itself.
But whichever way, it still comes back to planning. Is that right? The more that you're able to plan for different scenarios and different plans, the more likely you are to be prepared in the event of a pandemic.
That is absolutely correct, and that is what lay behind the views and advice that I gave, and on occasion the challenge that I had to give when we were being urged to stand up the hub at an earlier point than when we actually did.
My lady, that's a convenient point for the break.
Perfect timing, Mr Scott. I shall return at 11:30.
All right.
Mr Scott.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Stewart, there's one point I just want to put to you, and it's about the paper from February 2020. If we could just have up on the screen INQ 000391222. It's my fault for the delay rather than anybody else's, Mr Stewart. It's just on its way now. And so this is the minutes of the TEO departmental board meeting. The document that we were discussing earlier on, your note about the review, that would have been considered at this departmental board meeting.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And then if we scroll down the page, please. And we have 3B there. And it says Chris Stewart, so it's headed Strategic Review of Civil Contingencies across Northern Ireland. Chris Stewart provided an overview of the paper circulated, recording the importance of review of current arrangements given the changes in the strategic landscape that now impose new risks and considerations for civil contingency preparations. Following discussion, name redacted, noted the timely nature of the proposed review, the importance of engagement with key stakeholders, and the recording of all associated risks. It doesn't indicate there, would you agree, that it was considered that the review would be something that would be delayed to a point in future?
That isn't explicitly reflected in that paragraph, that's correct.
If that was the intention, would you have expected it to be explicitly referred to in that paragraph?
I wouldn't have necessarily seen that as an omission. I regarded the board's agreement as giving me permission to take forward the review at a time and in a manner of my choosing.
Thank you. If I can take you now, because I want to move on to the actual planning that was conducted rather than some of the approaches. If I can take you to INQ, that would be 400023220. So this is the note of the CCG meeting on Thursday, the 20th of February 2020. So again, just to orientate ourselves in time, this is before the briefing paper that we were discussing of the 25th of February and the TEO departmental board that we were just looking at. This is, could you just describe what the purpose of a CCG meeting was on the 20th of February 2020?
It's a little difficult to do so at this remove. I don't have a particularly clear recollection of it.
Well, can I help you?
Please.
So was it an indication that when you were contacted by the Department for Health in early February 2020, that there was a suggestion that be a meeting held by TEO in order to try and pull together some planning and preparation for the pandemic?
Yes.
Does that sound about right?
Entirely right, yes, forgive me.
And so is it likely that this is that meeting of the 20th of February?
It is exactly that, and you've jogged my memory. I think I referred to that in my statement.
Okay. So what we can see there is we have the priorities of isolation facilities, so the coronavirus bill, excess deaths, and then it's only at the bottom in terms of priorities that we have readiness, and it's all organisations to review business continuity plans in light of reasonable worst case parameters. There's no indication there that there's any specific role for CCPB, is that right?
There isn't an indication there, but I think implicit in that is review plans and pass them into CCBB.
Well, in terms of the organisations, that relates to the departments, is that right? And their arm's length bodies?
Their arm's length bodies, yes.
And then if we can just take off the zoom in section, and then we can see that we have the actions. Again, we can see at the bottom is the second one up from the bottom, TEO to issue a short questionnaire on readiness. Would that be a work that the CCPB needs to undertake?
Yes. The questionnaire was indeed issued by CCPB.
And then the departmental members to review readiness within their CNI. What does that mean, please?
Critical national infrastructure.
Thank you. So, and again, just for completeness, if we could just go over the page, please. So discussions there of working group meetings, C3 leads. So to consider the need for and potential content of a cumulative impact document. Does that meeting of the 20th of February indicate that actually at that point in time there wasn't any cumulative impact document in place in Northern Ireland about any prospective pandemic?
I'm not sure I could say that there wasn't anything, but it certainly wasn't fully developed at that stage.
Why was that it wasn't fully developed, or that there wasn't, well, why wasn't it fully developed by the 25th of February?
That was very much during the period where we were running very hard to try and recover the lost ground from the 18-month delay. And as I have conceded, we were not as well prepared as we ought to have been. We were trying to make up the deficit. And that's the reason why, on that date, things were not as advanced as they might have been.
Is it fair to say that, based on what you were just saying then, you were working hard to make up the deficit, but by the time of the 23rd of March, you actually hadn't made up the deficit?
What I would say is that by the 23rd of March, we had got to a certain point. We had issued and received the responses to that questionnaire. We had received the sectoral resilience plans from departments and carried out an initial overview of those. That was summarised in the table that I think Ms Dobbin referred to yesterday. That was clearly not the end of the story. Planning is not complete at that point, which is why, as I said earlier, the very welcome addition of Karen Pearson's team gave us a boost and allowed considerable volume of further work to be done on planning beyond that date. I would not claim that by that date planning was complete. In fact, I'm not certain that planning is anything that ever ends in this context.
At this point, around the 20th of February, do you think that the planning that had been conducted by the departments was sufficient in order to respond to the pandemic?
There were some gaps in it, and actually Ms Dobbin referred to one or two of them on the table yesterday, which is why in the final column of that table you'll see a red, amber, green assessment of the state of readiness. Not a terribly sophisticated analysis, I must concede, but nevertheless an initial view from CCPB on the state of readiness in each department.
Because again, I come back to the point that we canvassed very early on, that it's actually not for CCPB to carry out the planning in relation to individual sectors, that's for the departments.
That's correct.
And so your role in terms of the coordination role would be that you could press departments,
yes, and
you could ask them to cover certain specific areas and certain queries, but you couldn't do the planning for them.
Correct.
If I could just take you to INQ 000 325 143, and it's page 2 of this document. These are going to be some messages between yourself and Miss Rooney, Mr. Stewart. And they're from around the 8th of March, around 4:30 p.m. And just while we're waiting for that to come up, you can tell that from where it comes up in the middle of the text about. And thank you. So on the left-hand side, as we understand it, is messages from Bernie Rooney, and on the right-hand side are your messages.
I think that's correct, yes.
So we see Miss Rooney saying, okay, thanks. Should we circulate to PermSec seat lines on departments are considering? The only evidence I've seen of any real planning is economy. And you say, I think we need to wait for advice from Michael on the timing of this in Northern Ireland. Again, reference there to Michael, is that the CMO?
It would be the CMO, yes.
Why would you need to wait for advice from the CMO on the timing?
I'm afraid I'm not quite sure what it was that Mrs. Rooney was referring to in terms of what it was that we should circulate to permanent secretaries.
Okay. Well, then let's focus on the paragraph on the left-hand side at the bottom. I'm concerned about departments' delay in planning, all a bit slow at present, waiting to be asked and told what to do. If this is the 8th of March, is a suggestion here from Ms. Rooney that actually there hadn't been sufficient planning done by the departments?
I think that's the only construction that you could put in that sentence, but I'm not sure that I entirely agree with her assessment at that point, in particular the assessment in the paragraph above. By the 9th of March, we had an assembled table which set out the status and the state of planning in each department. There were clearly some gaps in it identified, but there was also, I think, evidence of a great deal of planning that had taken place.
Okay.
I'm afraid I respectfully disagree with my colleague on that.
Okay, well, let's take you to INQ quadruple 23226. It's likely to be page 18 that opens up, but hopefully we could start at page 1. Thank you. So this is the document that...
The very table that I referred to?
Yes. And again, it's the non-health sectoral resilience returns. Anything health-related would have been dealt with by the Department of Health. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so when it says version 2 in the top right corner, 13th of March.
Yes.
So
I think there was an earlier version on the 9th of March, which is why that is version 2.
So that's what you're saying was the totality of the planning that had come through to CCPB?
With respect, no. That's what I'm saying is the summary prepared by CCPB of the totality of the planning.
Okay. And then Ms. Dobbin asked Sir David Stirling about whether he considered that this document showed a sufficient level of planning. What's your view on whether this shows a sufficient level of planning at the 13th of March 2020?
I think it clearly identifies gaps. There are a number of ambers, and if memory serves me, I think further down the table there are perhaps 1 or 2 reds as well.
Yes. And then if we could just go to page 18, for example. So what happens in this document is that you've got tables for each of the individual departments?
Yes.
Yes. And so this is the department for communities. So if we were to look at, for example, the impact upon disabled people, would we naturally be wanting to be looking at the community section?
Yes.
Okay. And so we have there the key areas of concern: welfare services to the public. We've got the impact vulnerable citizen disproportionately impacted, and then the mitigations about a working group. Given that this is the 13th of March 2020, it doesn't look like there's a significant amount of planning in terms of the mitigations of the potential impact of the pandemic on disabled people. Would you agree with that?
Based on what's in front of us, yes. And I think the point might also be made that you would expect to see reference to the needs of disabled people in other departments' plans, not just those of the Department of Communities.
And you say that this is a summary table. Are you suggesting that this table would have distilled the key elements of that? That's the nature of a summary, isn't it?
It would have aimed to do so, yes. This, just to be absolutely clear, this is not a plan. This is a summary table of plans.
But it's going to contain effectively the highlight points of those plans?
It should do, yes.
Just want to then talk about planning. So when Miss Pearson arrived, and she, by the 17th of March, had produced a plan. Is that correct? It was described as a plan.
She had produced, if memory serves me, I think, a proposal to take planning to, if you like, the next level, or the next steps that she was advising that needed to be taken going forward.
Well, let me use your words on this. If we can see INQ 000325137. And this is going to be a message from yourself to Sir David Stirling on the 17th of March, 2020.
I suspect it's the one where I described it as a tour de force.
Yes, exactly. So your words are, Karen's planning paper is a tour de force, but I worry that it involves a complexity that will be hard to manage and hard for departments to populate without a major shift in resource and attitude. They struggle to get to the point where, again, name redacted, and Bernie handed over. So even by the 17th of March, are you expressing concerns there that there's not sufficient planning within the departments in order to meet the plan that had been advanced by Ms Pearson?
I don't think I was giving an overall judgment on the adequacy or otherwise of planning in departments at that stage. What I was saying was that it had taken considerable time and effort on the part of CCPB and indeed within departments to get to that point. Having, I wouldn't use the word struggle, but having experienced challenges in getting to that point, the more sophisticated and more comprehensive approach that Ms Pearson was recommending, I think rightly so, was going to be a considerable further challenge to departments going ahead. Hence, I was signalling very clearly that more resource was going to have to be applied within departments on planning.
Ms Pearson, as we've indicated, arrived around the 14th of March. She produced her plan on the 17th of March. Why wasn't an equivalent plan produced by CCPB earlier, even before Ms Pearson arrived?
I think it's fair to say that the approach that we took in CCPB prior to that point was less sophisticated. It was, as I described earlier, a bottom-up approach based on gathering together the plans, probing them for weaknesses, challenging where necessary, joining the dots and completing the picture. What Karen and her team brought to it was an altogether more sophisticated approach, and one which I characterise as top-down, which began more with an identification of the risks and then assessing how or whether those risks were reflected in departmental plans. The two approaches, I think, are quite complementary.
But is that not what CCPB should have been doing, a top-down approach, given your experience in civil contingencies, in terms of directing departments about what information you required, in the same way that the Civil Contingency Secretariat did at an early stage in the pandemic?
I accept that that would have been a better approach.
I'm going to be moving on to a different topic in relation to legislation planning. You said earlier on, Mr Stewart, that you wish to talk about the activation of NICMA. Would you please indicate what points you wish to make in addition to what Sir David Stirling said?
And I won't repeat the points that he made, other than to say that I agree entirely with his evidence that the judgment that we made at the time was that we had asked for activation at the right point. But like Sir David, I entirely accept that the inquiry may come to a different conclusion on that. The points I think have been well made and drawn out in your questioning, that there is a fine judgment to be made in identifying that transition point between planning and operations, because both are important. And it is a matter of judgment. Stand up too early and you may not have made sufficient progress on planning. Stand up too late and you may impede the response.
Yes. And if you have sufficient resources, you're able to both plan and prepare for the stand-up at the same time. Is that right?
Well, sufficient resources is a prerequisite to both modes, but I think another point that's worth bearing in mind is when you reach the operational point, the hub is new and involves a cadre of staff who join the operation at that point. Prior to that, and indeed from that point forward, other than hub staff, planning and operational response are actually carried out by the same teams of staff.
Unless there's any further you wish to add, I was going to move on to your role in terms of planning for the legislation, the initial set of regulations in 2020. So, after you had to relinquish the role of Chief of Staff of the Hub, which you've explained earlier on, the focus of your role was on preparing legislation, and that was what became the Health Protection Coronavirus Restriction Regulations Northern Ireland 2020, which was the governing set of restrictions that came in, and I think they were made on the 28th of March.
That's correct.
Now, what those restrictions did, in essence, was that you had you'd taken the English regulations, and then I think the way you describe it is that you made some necessary changes to reflect differences in administrative and enforcement arrangements. There doesn't appear to have been any particular consideration given to any specific features of Northern Ireland society which might be distinct from society in England. Is that right?
I think that's a fair comment.
When you were looking to bring in place those regulations, which they came in after Northern Ireland had entered into lockdown, correct? They were made on the 28th of March and lockdown was the 23rd of March.
Yes, but whether or not there was observance of lockdown prior to the regulations is not something I could give an authoritative view on.
No, but it's about your planning for the legislation and the circumstances you find yourself in at the time. Is that right, in terms of when you're drafting the legislation and
Yes.
the urgency?
So the announcement, as you say, was on the 23rd. The full detail of how that would be operationalised in England wasn't with us until the 25th, when we first had sight of the English regulations and indeed a set of regulations for Wales at that point. Thereafter, the task was to move as quickly as possible to have, as you say, broadly equivalent regulations made for Northern Ireland.
But there would have been time for consideration to be given to whether any amendments needed to be made to the substance of that legislation to reflect any specific features of life in Northern Ireland. Is that right?
Yes, but it was 2 days of very intensive effort even to do that.
Yes. But those regulations were going to have a significant impact on the entire population of Northern Ireland, and therefore you would agree that consideration needed to be given to what those regulations were going to do to the population?
I would accept that point, but what I would say again was in the period of 48 hours that it transpired we had in order to get the regulations made, that required a great deal of effort even to do it in the way that we did. I absolutely concede there would have been better ways of doing it in terms of giving consideration to those particular considerations that you've outlined, and indeed engaging in stakeholders and those very profoundly affected by the regulations, which there simply wasn't time to do.
Is it correct or not that there were 3 ministers who had an input into the content of those regulations? The First Minister, the Deputy First Minister and the Health Minister?
Yes, I think my advice went to all 3 simultaneously.
Did any other minister have any input into the content of those regulations before they were made?
At ministerial level, no, but there was intense engagement with colleagues in the Department of Justice to ensure that we had matters such as fines and penalties and enforcement correctly described in the regulations. I'm not sure that they would have referred that work to their minister. I very much doubt it.
Yes, but those were the administrative aspects. In terms of cross-cutting issues, was appropriate from ministerial level, there was no consideration of any minister other than the First Minister, Deputy First Minister and the Health Minister. Is that right?
Not until the entire matter came to the Executive for its approval.
Yes. Well, actually, when it came to the Executive, it was made by urgent procedure, wasn't it?
It was, but there was a remote engagement with all ministers prior to the regulations being made, largely by email and telephone.
And how long was that period?
It was over a few hours, I think, on the evening when the regulations were made. There may have been some contact the day before, but I regret I don't recall that clearly. Certainly the most intense period of engagement with ministers was in the hours before the regulations were actually made.
And there was a driver at that time in order to get the regulations made. Is that right?
Yes.
And who or what was driving that?
The need, as it was seen, to give urgent effect to the decision that had been announced on the 23rd.
Just want to ask, in terms of the relationship with the United Kingdom, recognise the difference in available resources between Cabinet Office and TEO. During the period from January 2020 to March 2020, were you receiving any assistance from CCS or anybody within Westminster about civil contingencies planning for the pandemic?
No.
So it was all requests, effectively, to assist their planning, as we've seen earlier on in that document from March?
That might be a little unfair to them. Requests and liaison, but not help in the sense of secondment of staff or anything of that nature.
No, but also, were they giving any indications about any suggestions about what you might be able to do in terms of getting more information out of the departments?
No.
And then one final topic, if we can just see INQ 000 409 665. And then this is an email from you dated the 25th of June 2021. And this followed on from the letter that had been circulated originally from the Cabinet Office about preserving records. And you set out there in detail to a number of if we could just scroll back to the top, a number of senior figures within the Executive Office.
And in fact, that's the top management team for the department.
Yes. And you're giving your advice, thoughts, understanding of issues that could arise. I mean, how far did you expect that advice to be disseminated?
To all staff who would have been in a position to contribute evidence to the inquiry.
And would you expect it to be escalated to ministers as well, or is this just something within TEO officials?
I confess I wasn't actually thinking of ministers at that stage. I was, as I think the note makes clear, reflecting on my own experience of an earlier public inquiry, a rather well-known one in Northern Ireland on renewable heat incentive. What I was trying to get across to colleagues was that unless you have experience of a public inquiry, it is very easy to underestimate or to be entirely ignorant of just what the inquiry's requirements might be in terms of information. And I wanted to ensure that no one was going to go into that situation without sufficient awareness. I wanted to ensure that colleagues were also in a position to take action early, because there is an enormous amount of effort involved in gathering together and collating the information that's necessary for an adequate response to a public inquiry. And to put it simply, the earlier you start, the better. And that was a sense of what I wanted to get across to colleagues.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. I have no further questions.
Can I just ask one question, pursuing something Mr. Scott asked you about, Mr. Stewart? You were asked about whether you received assistance from the Civil Contingencies Secretariat in London. Given sensitivities of a devolution settlement and Westminster not interfering and trying to undermine it, what would you need to do to get it? Would you need to ask for it normally? Is that what would happen? What would be the process if you did want help from a Whitehall department?
Exactly that. I think a simple request, and forgive me, perhaps I should clarify this. I wasn't meaning to imply in any way that any reasonable request was turned down by Cabinet Office Secretariat. We simply hadn't made one. I think that's probably a learning point going forward. CCPB will never be able to have the level of capacity or capability that Cabinet Office Secretariat has. And perhaps going forward, we should be more ready than we were in this instance to ask for that help.
And there's one point just on the back of my lady's point about devolution. If we can just go to INQ 000325137. Again, this is another message between yourself and Sir David Stirling on the 14th of March 2020. We can go to page 17, please. And again, so 14th of March. If we can go down to the bottom, please. So around the 14th of March, there were issues in relation to relationships within the executive and the approach. Is that correct?
Sorry, could you just direct me to the particular paragraph?
Well, on the right-hand side, just underneath where it says Saturday, 14th of March 2020.
Sorry, yes, I'm with you. I had misunderstood you.
Yes.
Yes, there were, and I think that was covered in some of the earlier sessions. That refers very specifically to the issue around the timing of the closure of schools.
Yes, I'm not interested in that bit. We can go further down to the message. We'll just scroll down, please. Thank you very much. And then there's, I believe this is a message from you to Sir David Stirling, I believe.
Yes, it is that I had attended the meeting of Irish and Northern Ireland ministers earlier in the day, and that was me giving a readout of the meeting to Sir David.
But because you say there, I'm having to work quite hard to keep NIO from jumping in. So far, our advice is being heeded, but SOS mad keen to get involved. For now, he's limiting himself to ringing Simon Coveney. Do you know why it seemed the NIO were mad keen to get involved, as you describe it?
The Secretary of State's natural exuberance.
Sorry, I missed that.
Secretary of State's natural exuberance, my lady.
Oh, right.
And you were seeking to prevent that from happening?
I was seeking to ensure that any intervention was helpful. If I perhaps may give an example from a different time which might illustrate that. There was at one point a degree of tension within the executive around the issue of the reopening of waste.
Sorry, just to interrupt, Mr. Unless it's an example of your specific involvement, I think maybe we can leave this to other individuals who might be able to better place to deal with this point.
It is an example of my specific involvement, and I hope it would help to illustrate my concern about ensuring that the Secretary of State's involvement was correct. If you would indulge me, my lady, for a couple of moments.
Do you know where we're going, Mr. Scott?
No.
I have you in tenterhooks now. There was an issue within the executive on the correct timing of the reopening of waste disposal centres. It was a difficult issue on which the executive struggled to gain agreement. The executive had come to the view that one particular local council, which was out of line with the executive's recommended approach, should be spoken to and asked to come back into line. At around about the same time, the Secretary of State intervened in the media, and the comments that he made were, they may be breaking the law, but I'm not going to criticise them if they're doing it for the right reasons. That, if I may put it mildly, was less than helpful in terms of maintaining the coherence of the executive's message at that point. I was very disturbed by that, and indeed raised my concerns with Northern Ireland Office colleagues and asked them to try and ensure that we maintained, as far as possible, a degree of consistency between what the Secretary of State was saying and what the executive was saying. Forgive me, it's not an example directly related to what you asked about, but I hope it does realise what lay behind my concern in ensuring that we were all square with NIO.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart.
Mr. Wilcock? Oh, Ms. Campbell, sorry.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Stewart, my name is Brenda Campbell, and I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Irish COVID bereaved. May we have back on screen, please, INQ 000 325 143, and it's a set of messages between you and Bernie Rooney, Ms. Bernie Rooney. You looked at some of them already this morning. And just to assist you, because the data is potentially important, we can see at the top that the messages start on Sunday the 8th of March at about 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. It's not a memory test. We know that a teleconference was taking place at this time between the Executive Office and the Cabinet Office and other Whitehall departments in advance of a COBRA meeting that was to happen on the Monday morning, this being the Sunday afternoon. And it's in relation to the requests that had come in on the Friday for various responses from Northern Irish departments in relation to their, if you like, civil contingency readiness. Okay. We also know, and we've heard some evidence of it yesterday, that the Chief Medical Officer had intervened in that response and, if you like, indicated that Northern Ireland would not be responding for reasons that he will no doubt be asked about. But you're on the right-hand side and Ms Rooney's on the left-hand side of these messages. And you message Ms Rooney and say, on call, obvious irritation with Northern Ireland non-response. And that's to the request from the Civil Contingency Secretariat that we've discussed. Ms Rooney says, yep, we did raise this on Friday with the DOH several times before speaking to you. Complete lack of interest from Department of Health Gold as they were packing up to go home, the inference being on a Friday afternoon. Maybe tricky for our ministers tomorrow. And we may put in brackets, at the COBRA meeting, B for Bernie. And you reply, David is aware. And that David would be David Sterling, is that right?
David Sterling, yes.
So the inference from Mrs Rooney's messages to you is that on the Friday evening when that request had come in, on several occasions she had sought the attention of the Department of Health in relation to a response. Is that right?
Yes.
On each of those occasions, there was a complete lack of interest or non-response.
Those are her words.
Yes. Well, she also indicates that she then spoke to you, so that non-response came in advance of speaking to you.
Yes.
Do you recall her speaking to you about it?
I don't, but I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of what's said there.
No, and indeed you don't actually question the accuracy of what's said in any response from you.
No.
And then she said there's a complete lack of interest from Department of Health Gold. Now help us please, what's DOH Gold?
DOH had within its own department a fairly orthodox arrangement for its civil contingencies response, gold, silver and bronze command. Gold would be the strategic level of command within any organisation in responding to a civil contingency. In essence, DOH Gold would have been the senior leadership team within DOH.
Yes.
And Professor Sir Michael McBride would have been, if not a member of DOH Gold, certainly in regular engagement with it.
Yes. Now, we don't know which individuals Ms Rooney managed to speak to, or indeed if any, or contact, but the complete lack of interest from DOH Gold means a complete lack of interest from those, if you like, at the top of the helm of the strategic response on a Friday afternoon in response to this urgent request from Whitehall.
That was Ms Rooney's assessment, yes.
And you say David is aware.
Yes.
Now, what was David aware of, Sir David Stirling?
I think, if I recall this correctly, and I think another sequence of text messages was examined. It was the one where I had indicated to Sir David that I faced a choice between annoying the Cabinet Office and annoying the Chief Medical Officer, and he gave his response to that in a particular way. So this is a follow-up to that. So that's what I meant by David was aware, which was that I had already flagged to him that we were coming under pressure from Cabinet Office to respond, but some very clear advice from Sir Michael McBride that a response was not, in his view, required at that time.
And in fairness to you, I think the chronology will prove your recollection correct, because that exchange of messages in relation to who better to annoy or who worse to annoy
Yes.
was the Saturday evening before these messages on the Sunday afternoon, and we know that.
If you'd permit me, it may assist the inquiry if I give a little more context there, because I think my use of the word annoy might be rather misconstrued. Sir Michael had a pivotal role in all of this, and he was under enormous pressure at that time, and his input to everything that we were doing was absolutely crucial to success. We had on a number of occasions prior to that acted or behaved in a way that he found not entirely helpful. There were one or two instances where he felt we were getting ahead of the opportunity for him to provide his advice and input into the exercise. So I was exercising, if you like, there an abundance of caution and wanting to ensure that we did not act in a way that made it more difficult for Sir Michael to discharge the very weighty responsibilities that he had around that time. I regret now, with hindsight, using the word annoy to describe that. I don't think that properly captures my intention.
Well, if I might, my lady, in light of the answer, there's a further message on page 4 of this document, and we're jumping ahead in the chronology because we're now at the Monday morning, and I'll just make sure I have the page correct, because we've gone to the Monday morning at 8:14 in the morning, and again you're messaging Miss Rooney and you're saying, bearing in mind what had just happened over the weekend,
I put it rather more pithily there. Yes.
Around Michael today. He's under considerable pressure, and rightly or wrongly, we are not in the good books. So extra caution, please. And Miss Rooney replies, essentially, she's keeping her head down and doing what she's told. Now, by the Monday morning, did you get the impression that you, for whatever reason, you or your team or the CCPB were not in Dr. McBride or Professor McBride's good books?
I think it stemmed from earlier than that. As I say, I think there were one or two instances where Michael was concerned that we were, if I could put it perhaps too simplistically, jogging his elbow a little bit, and that's what I was reporting there. I should say in relation to that, that to the extent to which we were doing that, that's my responsibility and not the responsibility of any member of the team.
Back on track, if we may, in relation to my questions. Could we go then to page 2 of the same document? And we're back in the time of the meeting on that Sunday afternoon with your colleagues across in Whitehall. And Miss Rooney, the conversation continues about, no doubt prompted by what's happening in the meeting itself. And she says on the left-hand side of the page, Northern Ireland is bound to struggle with adult social care, and I don't think that the Department of Health want to think about it. Now, you reply, and this is what we looked at briefly a moment ago with Mr. Scott, that you will do a quick email to ministers after this just to warn them that the slide deck is coming. And it's in that context that Ms Rooney then says the only evidence that she has seen of any real planning is in economy. Okay, and I'll come back in a moment to that. But here you are in a conversation with one of your senior colleagues who is saying the Department of Health don't appear to want to think about adult social care, and it is plainly an area in which we're bound to struggle. The first observation is you don't disagree with Ms Rooney in this message, do you? You don't say, actually, there's lots of work ongoing and there's lots of planning ongoing, so fear not.
I neither agreed nor disagreed with it. That was Ms Rooney's assessment. Personally, I wouldn't have felt in a position to make that assessment.
Well, we heard yesterday from Sir David that if anybody was, if you like, holding that strategic or overarching role in terms of what departments were doing at this period of March, it probably would have been you, although it's fair to say he maybe didn't say it definitely was you.
I think he could perfectly reasonably have said that it was me. Yes, that was my responsibility.
Well, if in fact there was a great deal of work going on or evidence that the Department of Health did want to think about adult social care, well, firstly, what was it? What was that work?
I can only answer you on the basis of what I was aware of at that time, and I was not aware of any significant deficiency in the Department of Health's planning in that regard. I honestly don't know what prompted Ms Rooney to advance that view.
Well, in fairness, in answering questions to Mr Scott, you did say that you respectfully disagreed with her assessment, that the only evidence of any real planning that she had seen was in economy.
Yes.
And you respectfully disagreed, and we can see that all was a bit slow at present.
Yes.
You see, you didn't, in fact, respectfully disagree at the time, because if we go to the top of the next page, we do see your answer coming in to Ms Rooney. And it's, well, I did try to kickstart it on Friday.
Would you mind showing me just the page above that?
Absolutely.
I'm not quite sure what the
So it is important to see these in context. If we start at the top, about a third of the way down page 2.
Yes, so what Ms Rooney is indicating there, she's concerned about the delay in departments' planning, a bit slow at present, waiting to be asked and told what to do. And then my response to that was, I did try to kickstart it on Friday.
Yes. So what had you tried to kickstart on Friday?
I'm afraid I don't recall in detail exactly what I referred to at that stage, but clearly I think the only construction that you can put on that was that I felt there was a need to give some further impetus to whatever departments were doing at that point. But I should make clear perhaps an important distinction here. The CEO's role in coordinating sectoral resilience planning covered all departments except one, the Department of Health.
Yes. Thank you, Lady.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. I think that completes the questions for you, Mr Stewart. Thank you for your help.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you.
Lady Mayor,
Stop
call
in.
the next witness, please, Dr. Joanne McLean.
Could we wait till people stop moving, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat. Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
My name is Joanne McLean.
And you ought to have a witness statement in front of you.
I do.
think you signed it on the 20th of February of this year.
That's correct.
And are you content that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge?
I am, yes.
Thank you, Dr. McLean. I think it's right that you're the current director of the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland.
That's correct, yes. I have been the Director of Public Health in the Public Health Agency since September 2022. Prior to that, immediately prior to that, I was working as an Associate Deputy Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health, and that was from June 2021 until my appointment in the PHA in August 2022.
I'll stop you there. I'll just take you through, if I may, your career. I think that you're a medical doctor by qualification.
That's right.
And I think, in fact, you're still a clinician. You still remain practicing. Is that also correct?
I am, yes. I graduated from Queen's University in 1999, and I've remained a practicing doctor since then, and I'm on the GMC register as a consultant in public health medicine.
And I think you had a very early specialisation in public health. Is that correct?
I did, yes. After I completed several years of clinical training and junior doctor roles, I commenced the Northern Ireland Public Health Medicine Training Scheme in 2004, I think. And I then completed that and took up my first post as a consultant in 2011.
And I think it's right that that was in the Public Health Agency.
That's correct. That was in the Public Health Agency.
And I think it's also right that, in fact, your specialisation is in children's public health and the commissioning of children's services. Is that right?
So public health training is generic, so you're trained right across the curriculum, including health protection, service, public health, health improvement. Prior to taking up my current post, my consultant post, I had a particular focus on children's public health, children's services and the health and well-being of children.
And in fact, during the pandemic, I think at the beginning you remained in your role.
I did.
In terms of commissioning children's services. But at a point in time, and we'll come to this, you in fact moved role, as it were, so that you could assist in the provision of advice in respect of care homes. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. In the initial stages of the pandemic, I helped and assisted with contact tracing in those very early days. And then my focus was on my substantive post. And in that role, I prepared mainly children's services for the oncoming wave of infection. I then went on and assisted in Public Health Agency responding to care homes. That was from around about April, earlier mid-April 2020. I continued in that role and I also worked in the provision of highly specialised services, a role that I supported my colleagues in the Health and Social Care Board with. And then sort of towards the end of the summer in early September, then I was redeployed again, and at that point I led the Public Health Agency's response to COVID infections in schools.
All right. Now,
Dr. McLean, you're like me, you speak very quickly. I don't know if that's
Sorry,
what
it
you
was
were saying.
exactly what I was about.
It's very difficult to change one's pattern of speech. I know all too well, but if you could
I'll try.
slow it down. Sorry to interrupt, Mr.
No, I was about to say, thank you, Dr. McLean. Now, I know that you're obviously going to give evidence on behalf of the Public Health Agency, and I will ask a little bit about your experience in terms of providing advice in respect of care homes as well. But I'll start, if I may, with the role of the Public Health Agency. And I think it's right that the Public Health Agency in Northern Ireland, and if you need a place or if you want to look, it's in your statement at paragraph 10, but it has 3 core functions, doesn't it?
So the Public Health Agency was established in 2009, and it was really established because of the importance of public health, and the main aim was to improve public health and with a particular focus on reducing health inequalities. Within that, there are 3 main areas of work that we have. They are health protection, which is responding to cases and clusters and outbreaks of infectious diseases. also pandemic preparedness and responding to threats to health that are posed by the environment, maybe water pollution, things like that. We also have a responsibility for health improvement, and we lead and commission a whole range of programmes, from encouraging people to stop smoking to exercise more, but also really supporting communities who are disadvantaged to sort of take actions to improve their health, and that's called our health improvement team. And then we also have a team who focus on the provision of public health advice into the commissioning and delivery of health services. And within that team, we are also responsible for the commissioning and quality assurance of population screening programmes. And the agency then also has a lead function for research and development across the health and social care system, not just in public health.
All right, so of these three functions, I think it's obviously the health protection function that came to the fore during the pandemic, but obviously with some overlap in terms of the Public Health Agency's role in respect of inequalities as well.
Yes.
Correct. All right. I'll ask you a bit more about inequalities shortly. I just want to stay, if I may, on the role of the Public Health Agency. It's also right that it's an arm's length body of the Department of Health.
That's correct. Yes.
And that the Chief Medical Officers Group is the departmental sponsor for the Public Health Agency as well. Is that right?
That was right at the time of the pandemic. So from the establishment of the agency in 2009, right up until fairly recently, I think possibly, can't quite remember, but I think it may have been April or maybe January of this year, the sponsor branch has moved from the Chief Medical Officer's office to another Deputy Permanent Secretary within the Department of Health. And that's quite a new arrangement, and that was just part of a wider reorganisation of functions and responsibilities within the Department of Health.
I'm going to ask you to just try and slow down again. But just coming back to the time, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about the background to the Public Health Agency, but could you just help us in terms of the sponsorship role and what that was intended to provide to the Public Health Agency?
So my understanding is that the sponsorship role is to provide direction, to make sure that the agency performs its statutory duties as they are supposed to, and also that the agency is delivering to a sufficient quality, delivering in line with the Department of Health and therefore the Minister's wishes. The form that sponsorship takes is that there are regular meetings between the chair of the Public Health Agency and the Chief Executive with either the Permanent Secretary, the sponsor within the department, where they go through a range of issues where the agency may escalate things that they believe are a risk or an issue, and the department may seek assurances on some parts of our delivery.
And Dr. McLean, I think you're aware that from around 2017, issues were being raised with the Public Health Agency by its sponsor about its capacity and capability to carry out its core functions. Is that correct?
I think the documentation that I have seen relating to that time mainly comes from the documents that are reviewed in preparation for giving evidence today. And most of that was around staffing within the Health Protection Division, particularly staffing and the availability of consultant staff, specialist consultant staff to lead areas of work within that. At the time of establishment of the agency, there had been, I'm not sure of the exact number, but there had been maybe 9-10 consultants in health whose special interest with health protection, and that number had gone down as low as 3, I think, not long before the Public Health Agency was established.
All right.
Or before the pandemic happened.
The pandemic happened.
Sorry.
Well, I'm going to start in 2017. Mm-hmm. So I think the issues that were being raised in 2017 was because of the depletion in staff and experience. There was concern that the PHA couldn't carry out its core functions.
That's right.
And again, the following year in 2018, the issue was raised again as to whether or not the PHA was going to be able to carry out its core functions. Is that also correct?
From the evidence I have seen in my bundle, yes, that is correct.
And again, I think that it's right that between 2018 and 2020, the situation deteriorated still further in terms of that loss of critical staff and experience within the PHA.
That's correct. The numbers had gone down significantly for a range of reasons. Mainly people had retired, come to an age whenever they retired. It is quite a specialist role, so the staff who we need to fill those posts are highly specialised staff. They are consultants, like I am in public health, but for them they would have chosen to maintain an interest in health protection. So at the point you achieve a certificate of completion of training in public health, that is across all the public health domains. But once you go into consultant practice, a lot of people, and certainly practice within the agency, up until that point was that you went and worked primarily in one of the domains. So health protection is what we're talking about now. Other people chose to go, like I did, and work in service development and screening.
And I think the net result of that was that at the advent of the pandemic, I think there were very, very few people indeed within the PHA who had any sort of experience of dealing with a widespread outbreak of any infectious disease. Is that right?
I think there were a small number of very experienced consultants who had many years' experience and would have had experience of dealing with significant outbreaks, including, for example, the swine flu outbreak in 2009, the pandemic in 2009, but their numbers were small. And just before the pandemic, the agency had some success in recruiting a number of locum consultants into the agency, so that was a good thing to stabilise and improve staff as we went based into the pandemic.
I think it's right. We've seen some email correspondence that there were possibly 2 people in the PHA who had some role or experience of dealing with swine flu in 2009. Does that sound about right?
So I think that there were many more people within the agency who had experience of dealing with swine flu in 2009. I think the correspondence to which you're referring to is from an official in the Department of Health who has made a comment that only 2 people in a very senior role within the agency were around in 2009, and that they, in 2009, had not been in very senior roles. There were a significant number of staff who had been in the agency in 2009, including, for example, me, but at a much more junior level. I think what that correspondence goes on to talk about, I suppose, change at a senior level in the public health agency. So I know we're talking about consultants and specialist staffing, but there was concern around change at senior level as well.
But just coming to someone like you, for example, and whatever experience you had as a junior doctor in 2009, you would have been 10 years qualified. I mean, would your involvement at that stage in any way have equipped you for dealing with something much more significant than swine flu?
I think there was learning for everyone, no matter what level of the agency that we were at the time. I think that following that, there were a number of exercises because there were very few people, actually, if any, across Northern Ireland who would have had to deal with something on the scale of COVID, because no one had.
Of course.
The sort of things that would have happened was we would have had significant outbreaks that would have tested us, and there's learning in that and how you scale up staffing and things to respond to things, but nothing on the scale of COVID. And I think that's true for a lot of agencies. I think one of the ways that we prepared, in common with other agencies as well, would have been through exercising. So at national level, local level, running pandemic exercises, testing plans. But that, as we learned, is very different to doing it for real.
And I think we'll probably find, we'll look at what eventuated in terms of the PHA's role, but would it be right to say at this stage, and please say that if you disagree, that any of those planning exercises proved wholly inadequate to the mammoth task that faced the PHA from January onwards?
I think it's fair to say that the PHA was not prepared in a number of ways. and I wouldn't try to argue that we were. I think we had a number of strengths, but I don't think we would have been prepared. But I think that was true probably of every public health organisation and body across the world, because it was such an unprecedented event.
All right, well, we'll come and we'll examine some of those issues in a little bit more detail. I just want to go back to the role that PHA would ordinarily expect to play whenever there's an outbreak of an infectious disease. I think, first of all, its role in respect of infectious disease is actually a statutory one. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So by statute, part of its role is to respond, is that correct, to an outbreak of an infectious disease? That's
right. So most of our statutory responsibility and powers in relation to responding to infectious diseases comes from the 1967 Public Health Act, the Northern Ireland Public Health Act. So that talks about particular powers, and it talks about the Director of Public Health having particular powers with respect to a range of notifiable diseases, and it talks about powers to issue things like a notice to exclude someone from school, work, things like that. So that's around responding to cases of notifiable diseases. We also then, building on that, have responsibilities to try to stop the spread of infectious diseases within the community, and that if you get more than one case, then that would be moving into an outbreak response, and we have a range of things that we do. We discharge those responsibilities not by ourselves. So even to diagnose infectious diseases, we rely on our colleagues in primary care to notify us. And the notifiable disease part of this is that if a medical practitioner, and I think the 1967 Act is written about medical practitioners, but if a medical practitioner suspects that an individual is suffering from one of a whole range of notifiable diseases, by law they have to inform, and the Act says the Director of Public Health. So then we receive those notifications and take appropriate action in relation to them. So within the PHA there's essentially a team of people, and that's their function within the PHA. And can you help the inquiry in terms of the number of people who were in that team at the outbreak of the pandemic in January 2020? Yeah, so I'll have to look at my notes for the exact number so I don't mislead you, but so within the Public Health Directorate, in January 2020, we were divided up into 4 divisions. So there was health protection, which is that team that will come to. There was service development and screening, health improvement, and the R&D team. So the team who would respond to infectious diseases in the way I've described were drawn from the health protection team. So I'm looking at my statement here, paragraph 19, I think it is. There are some tables, and it says that in the 31st of December 2019, there were just short of 40 whole-time equivalent staff within that health protection team. All right. So, a small team of people. And are they all clinicians? Are they all doctors and nurses, or do you have other types of staff within that 40? No, within that there are a small number of consultants, most of whom are medical. We also have some registrars who are in training in public health. We also have a team of nurses who have specialist expertise and experience in both health protection, public health, and infection control. And then we also have surveillance scientists, and we have project managers within the team and admin support as well. So that 40 includes a whole range of functions, and any of the individual teams are quite small. All right. Now, I'm going to ask you a bit about the PHA's role in this silver within the orthodox emergency response. So first of all, that's within the Department of Health, isn't it? They have a gold, silver, bronze response to an emergency. So the emergency response plan that the health and social care system in Northern Ireland organise themselves to respond to issues is set up, and I think it's standard emergency planning practice. I'm not an expert emergency planner, but this is a standard way to respond, that you have a gold command type level, and that sits in the Department of Health. And then you have a regional layer, which was silver, and that is made up of the Public Health Agency, And where we take the lead in silver, it would be mainly in response to something that was of public health nature, so infectious diseases like the pandemic.
I'm going to ask you to stop because I can take you to a document that sets all of that out. But was I suppose the question is really this: when those structures were stood up, that's the term used, I think that was on the 23rd of January 2020, correct?
That's right.
And the PHA formed part of the silver response alongside it's the HSBC, isn't it? It's the Health Service
Health and
Board.
Social Care Board, yes. HSCB, and the other organisation that sits at silver level with us is the Business Support Organisation.
And can I just check then, at that silver level, is it intended then that the PHA are part of the operational response or still part of the strategic response to the pandemic?
So at that stage, we are providing a strategic response, but I think we have two roles here. So at that time, silver was set up, and it was, my understanding is, a public health led silver at that time. And that was quite early in the pandemic in January, whenever we didn't have any cases, even in the UK, but there was a lot of concern, there was a lot of information coming in from a lot of sources, and obviously then we need to be getting ourselves ready to provide an operational response within the Public Health Agency to deal with the cases. But then the other role of silver at that stage would have been to help our health service, our providers, our trusts be ready to respond, because they will have had lots of questions around how should they organise their services. What was the guidance if someone turned up who had been in one of the affected areas? What should they do with them? Lots of other questions about how they operationally would implement the guidance. So the guidance was coming in from all sorts of areas, and silver at that stage was very much focused on trying to collate, curate the guidance and make sure it got out to the right people properly, and that questions that came up were answered. At that stage, that was the focus of silver.
I'm just I'll take you to the document and ask if it accurately reflects what the PHA's role was supposed to be. If I could ask for INQ 000325 It's the first page of this document. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Dr. McLean. It ought to have been with your...
I have seen it.
You have seen it.
I have seen it, yeah.
Good. And we can see that that's dated the 2nd of March. I think there may have been terms of reference before this, but this is slightly later on in the day. So may give us a slightly more considered idea of what the PHA's role was intended to be. And I think if we look at section 8 of this document, it sets out, I won't read through all of them, but I just wanted to draw attention to some of them. So the PHA was going to jointly run an emergency operations centre, correct? I'll ask you about it. I just want to make sure that to ask you whether or not these were things that the PHA was intended to do as part of its role at Silver.
So these terms of reference are from a period whenever PHA were no longer in the lead for running the Emergency Operations Centre. In the early days, PHA was running the Emergency Operations Centre because it was primarily about health information that was coming in. By this stage, the focus was very much on preparing the service. So it would have been the Health and Social Care Board who were taking the lead in running the Emergency Operations Centre at that time. We would have helped and assisted, but my understanding is that by March it was the Health and Social Care Board who were in charge of running the EOC, and we were there in a supportive way. It was the opposite way earlier on.
That's what I was going to ask you, because that's what I thought from your statement, but that helps to clarify that. That there was also going to be the provision of a joint situation report to the Department of Health as well.
I believe that is the case, and I believe that did happen, and I've seen examples of that as part of my preparation.
All right. And then the third point was that the PHA was going to maintain surveillance systems of COVID-19 cases and outbreak investigation. And again, at that point in time, was that the intended position, that that's what the PHA would do?
Yes, and that would be part of our core function in Public Health Agency, a really important part of responding to infectious diseases is knowing how many infections there are in the community and any changes in that infection, and the sort of technical term for that is surveillance. So that was a core bit of our function.
So of all of the things that the PHA was going to do at this point in the pandemic, would that have been the most important or the most significant?
It would have been one of a number
Right.
of surveillance, of important things.
And then the next one was to adapt guidance on the management of cases and their contacts. And again, can I check, was that foreseen as being a PHA role?
Because I wasn't here at the time, I feel I'm not able to comment in a lot of detail, but what I can say is that it would be my expectation that as information on the infection came in, we would have had a role in disseminating that. We're not a provider of clinical care, so any provision of clinical guidance would have to be in consultation with clinical teams who look after patients. It wouldn't be something that I would expect us to do on our own.
Well, that's what I wanted to check, because I think your witness statement suggests that in fact the PHA did not produce that kind of guidance.
So I think there were lots of different types of guidance were produced during the pandemic, and I think at this stage there were, for us in public health at that stage, I think they were in two main categories. The first would have been around guidance and how to manage cases from an sort of infection control point of view. And the first part of that is, first of all, how do you know you have a case? So that case definition. When is the case infectious? We didn't really know at that time, but when is the case infectious? What should you do in response if you have a suspected case? That to me is the public health management guidance, and that is something that we absolutely would be responsible for taking a lead on. We didn't develop that by ourselves, because this was now an emergency of an international significance. It was a huge event, and in situations like this, we look to sort of our colleagues in other parts of the UK who have a very large public health response team,
So
and are
is
really
this Public
specialised.
Health- Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you, but is that Public Health England?
Yes, so that would have been Public Health England. So in terms of, we didn't create guidance of public health nature from scratch, because we couldn't have done it. We wouldn't have had the expertise, and we wouldn't have added anything by doing it, because if you remember, and I think it does reference it in my statement as well, a lot of the information was emerging from other parts of the world. It was emerging from all sorts of places. We wouldn't have that in-house capability, and because a lot of the information was coming from international partners, WHO, and to an extent ECDC and other bodies like that, that sort of liaison at a UK level is with the single national contact point, which is in Public Health England, or was in Public Health England at that time.
Ask you to pause then. Is it right then that Public Health England would have essentially taken all of that information, distilled it
Yes.
as it saw fit, produced guidance, and you then would have essentially adopted that guidance?
Yes.
Rather than doing that?
Yes, we might have had to tailor it a little bit
course.
to take account of our situation here, but by and large that was guidance that was rightly produced by people who are very specialist in that area. I wasn't in this role at the time, but what does happen, and has happened in other incidents that have happened since I have taken up post, is that the people who do this in Public Health England do liaise with their colleagues in the devolved administrations and even the English regions at times. So there was that communication, but guidance changed really, really rapidly, more quickly than anything I've seen before or since. So I hope I'm not diverting here, but this bit, the management of clinical cases and the clinical management of the illness might be something we would be involved in the Public Health Agency, but we would very much depend on our clinical colleagues to advise us. We might help corral that and get it into a consensus document. But at that stage, both the public health guidance and the clinical guidance was very much new. It was not something that PHA would have developed from scratch, and we would have done it with the appropriate partners, either Public Health England for the public health guidance, and then if there was a need for clinical guidance locally for anything to come out from the silver level, that would have to be done with clinical colleagues.
All right, I'm going to try and just finish off this document, if I may. But the other part of your role that was foreseen at this time was that you would provide timely and accurate information for public and health professionals on Covid-19 and the clinical effects of the infection. Now, what we'll come to and what we'll look at is the provision by the PHA to data effectively at this point in time. Is that what that's talking about at this stage?
It's hard for me to know entirely because I wasn't involved in formulating this, but I'm reading it and I'm thinking it probably is around providing information on the number of cases we have and how it's spreading within the community. The clinical effects of the infection, that is something that would not be a primary function. Normally now we do work closely with colleagues and can help disseminate that, but I'm not really sure what was meant by that at that time.
All right, and I think provide advice on when to cease measures to slow transmission of the virus if they've been commenced.
Yes.
Again, would that actually have been a role of the PHA at that time?
Provide advice. So possibly, but I'm very conscious that this was an incident that was, even by this stage, being managed very much on a UK-wide basis. So for something of this significance, I'm not sure that, now I have the benefit of 4 years of hindsight looking at this, but actually the point at which you have to change your strategy, possibly.
All right, and maybe we can come back to that after lunch, if that's a good
Yes, of course.
point to break.
I shall return. I'm sorry, I hope you were warned that we'd have to break in the middle of your evidence, Dr. Payne. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, it's
I shall return at 1:45.